Hi, my name is Scott Keller, and today I'd like to discuss with you how to measure quality in online schools and the courses which they offer. You know, it's been said that if you have no idea where you want to go, any direction will get you there. And unfortunately, in today's environment of online education, state education officials, as well as local school board and school district officials, are in that boat of not knowing where they want to go because things are moving so quickly and things are going past their level of expertise. Luckily, we have organizations such as the International Association for K-12 Online Learning, or iNACOL for short, which can help give them guidance and guidelines and help them stay in the right direction. So when we're talking about measuring quality in online education, we have to know why are we measuring it. We should know who we want to measure, and this will be a little different than it is in traditional schools. I'll discuss this in just a minute. What factors should we measure about these students to get the outcomes of education that we all so urgently desire? When should we start implementing this? It sounds like the answer is now, but sometimes things have to take different courses because of different situations. We'll discuss when we should start it. And how should we go about implementing this plan? iNACOL has several recommendations, but I have a few criticisms because I say, no, really, how? Is what they're saying feasible? In my opinion, much of what they say is not feasible simply because of the politics involved. So let's get into why measure quality. Who are the target audiences of the outputs of this quality assurance measurements? As I mentioned, state, county, and school district policymakers, online school administrators, and other stakeholders, such as teachers and parents, need to understand how to assess the effectiveness of online schools in order to create better outcomes for the students who attend them. They need to know what works, and just as importantly, what doesn't. Okay, now let's get into who we should measure. This seems like a straightforward question. iNACOL says that we should focus on individual students. And this is something that is a little different in online schools than traditional schools. In traditional schools, you have a whole cohort moving together as one through each grade level, and things are measured by grade level. However, when you can take online courses at your own pace, some will move fast, others will move slower. So you really have to think about measuring the individual as opposed to measuring the group or cohort. Another thing is that we need to focus on student outcomes and not on inputs. Traditionally, course materials such as curricula and textbooks have used input-based assessments such as meeting state content standards or passing textbook reviews. This is important, of course, but the problem is when trying to determine the effectiveness of online courses and materials, these inputs are simply not correlated with student outcomes. Thus, we need to measure individual students and their outcomes from taking online courses. Input-based assessments are important to make sure courses cover what they need to, but they don't help us evaluate the effectiveness of the course materials. The next question is, what should we measure? iNACOL has a set of 5 performance metrics which they want us to measure. Proficiency is the first one. They say it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. And it's the most commonly measured thing now. When you test somebody, now you're probably testing their proficiency. ways to measure proficiency now include state assessments, end-of-course exams, and national and international tests. The second factor that we need to measure is individual student growth. This measures proficiency, skills, and knowledge gained in a given period of time. There are two types. There's a simple growth model, which measures academic growth between 2 points in time without making assumptions about the influence of schools or educators. Then there's the value-added type, which attempts to estimate the influence of schools or classrooms on the academic growth rates of a group of students with statistical confidence. They are more complex, and you need a statistician or economist on staff to do this second type of model. For quality assurance, should be based on individual students and track multiple data points. Graduation rate is the third factor that we are looking for, important indicator of future economic and social success. Be careful though, because student mobility and credit deficiencies when a student moves to a new school are often not considered. Using this creates a disincentive for enrolling students who are behind in proficiency, dropouts, or older because of the negative impact on the graduation rate. College and career readiness. Definitions vary, but basically success is defined as completing of the entry-level courses or core certificate courses at a level of understanding and the proficiency that allows the students to go on. And finally, closing the achievement gap, done by having greater levels of advancement in lower performing subgroups. So altogether, these five perform a much more robust understanding of student outcomes than the proficiency model and sometimes the proficiency and growth models, which we've normally done in traditional schools. Now we get to what seems like the obvious question: when should we measure? National efforts are a few years away. Common Core Standards assessments, such as the Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium, or SBAC, and the Partners for Assessment of Readiness for College and Careers, or PARC, are still a little ways off. These are outcomes-based assessments, which is great, but they are a few years off, and the improvements will vary by state. The problem is it takes a long time for them to get here. But we need to assess now. Online school enrollment is skyrocketing. States need to evaluate schools now. This iNACOL document offers guidelines for these assessments, what we can do now before the federal core standard assessments are complete. So now it comes to how should we measure these keys. iNACOL recommends, of course, that we measure all five of their metrics. We should measure individual student growth and performance. Again, individuals, not cohorts. We should assess untested subjects with validating instruments. I think this is a very good idea. You want to make sure that students who may have come from another state or another district and you don't have their records that come with them, in other words, they're untested, you validate where their level is to start with so that you can get some idea of growth. Then you want to disaggregate online school data from other schools. The reason they mention this is that in some states, such as Minnesota, all the data for all schools was rolled up into one, so you couldn't tell what online schools were doing as far as outcomes go compared to normal schools. And you want to ensure that online schools get student records in a timely manner. This is an idea that will probably be unmet in reality, in my opinion. Already, there's a disincentive for schools. They consider themselves as losing students when they go to an online school, so they're already dragging their feet. Sure, you can make mandatory these things. However, even with mandatory things from the state level, it still takes time. Alternatively, iNACOL suggests states should get a database or a computer solution so that they can hold the records, and therefore everybody will have access wherever the student moves within the state. You still have problems in between states. Again, I have a feeling that this might be more of a pipe dream. The seventh recommendation on implementation is to upgrade and align data systems for collecting and reporting. From my perspective, this is a pipe dream because I've just been through a whole course of political discourse which says we need to cut costs and reduce funding for a lot of things. This would require a massive amount of new equipment and software in order to get our data systems for all these disparate agencies at the local, state, and federal level, because you have to have many students going in between states. So all this collecting and reporting and sharing is fine, and it may work for online schools because the data is already there. When they take the test, it's already online, so they can do it. But the paper-based schools, the old schools, it may take many, many years before that could happen. And we need to address student reasons for moving in data systems. In other words, the data systems need to account for such factors as students being moved into online classes because they are credit deficient or because they're too old and some school wants to make themselves look better by moving a student to an online school. That was the school level. Now, within a course level, this is their iNACOL recommended course level outcomes-based quality assurance. Many courses are not covered by standardized exams. You want to measure proficiency and individual growth in these courses. You have an end-of-course exam for proficiency and a pretest, which helps reveal growth outcomes. You've taken a pretest in this course. At the end of this course, you'll take an end-of-course exam, and you can see yourself. I will provide you with the data when everybody has taken these. iNACOL does mention a second way of doing this. Instead of a pretest to reveal growth, you have prerequisites to ensure students are ready. However, in my view, a pretest and then an end-of-course exam would give you a better idea of growth within a course. Here is the iNACOL suggested rubric to evaluate current school performance measures. I'd like you to pause the video here and take a look at some of these rubrics and see what you think about them. Now that we've seen the guidelines and guidance from iNACOL on how to measure quality in online schools and courses, I'd like to take a look at what they have to say about perverse incentives in the present school systems that may cause challenges for implementing their guidelines. Then I will give a couple of my own and finally wrap up with final thoughts. In other words, can we really achieve this? Let's take a look at the first perverse incentive they mention: yearly grade level assessments. However, in online schools, students can quickly go through the course material and will be at different levels in the same period of time. What if accountability also rewarded significant growth so that these schools would get credit for students who outperformed? The second perverse incentive iNACOL mentions is that some school districts offer extra funding for low English proficiency students. If the school does a great job helping the student grow proficiency, however, when they succeed, they lose the extra funding. What if schools were rewarded for significant proficiency growth? The third perverse incentive that iNACOL mentions is the concept of funding per student based on one or two count days, generally one in the fall and one in the spring, where the students are counted. This provides incentives for all schools to enroll students just prior to those count days. What if there were multiple count days for partial year funding, which would decrease the incentive to enroll at a particular time? Yet another perverse incentive is that schools have incentive to show new students are behind. In other words, if they want to show significant growth, they first have to show that the student can't perform well. This is even a problem with the growth part of the iNACOL guidelines. Any ideas? Another perverse incentive schools have is that in some districts they have a threshold of proficiency, and once they meet that threshold, they have no incentive to help lower proficiency students. How about instead of measuring proficiencies by thresholds of numbers of students, students were individually tracked and the funding was not done by threshold but by student? That would go along with the iNACOL standard and it would solve this problem. Yet another perverse incentive is that schools often dump underperforming students into unique schools. A certain school, perhaps a new online school, is considered unique and they serve underperforming students. So districts have incentives to move students there so other schools rate higher. What if growth was tracked by individual student and mobility was transparent, so it was obvious that this was happening? The last perverse incentive that I'll mention is schools have an incentive to encourage low performers to transfer before graduation or assessment period. This is very much related to number 6, where they dump low performing students into unique schools. Right before a high stakes test or graduation, which is also a measure for schools, they have an incentive to get rid of the students that will cause their scores to be lower. What if growth, again, was tracked by individual student and mobility was transparent? Now I have some final thoughts on where have I seen this before. I've been working in a state law enforcement agency since before 9/11/2001. As you may recall, after that time, we had all kinds of calls for why didn't law enforcement talk to each other. So they dumped a lot of money into a lot of data systems in order to allow law enforcement agencies to talk to each other. The problem is not technological. The problem is political. Each agency wanted to get everybody else's data, but nobody wanted to give up their own because once they gave up their own data, somebody else could do something with it. This is the whole problem. It's political. A second thing this reminds me of is the entire healthcare system and what's going on with it. We have all kinds of different players in the healthcare system, and they all have perverse incentives. For instance, doctors are incentivized to give extra tests that are unnecessary simply to avoid malpractice suits. In fact, part of Obamacare is considering looking at the outcomes of patients rather than the inputs. And that sounds very similar to this iNACOL standard for online schools. In both cases, the idea is great. The question is if we can get the politics to work in favor of this approach. Two of the guidelines I find are going to be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to implement. One deals with data systems, which they say must be upgraded and better aligned to meet the challenge of collecting, reporting, and passing data between schools and the state. This is because all governments have had a real problem with budgets, and our national budget deficit is creating a lot of deficit hawks, which is going to lead to less money and not more money for schools. And the money that they get will probably not be poured into what would be considered an administrative cost to data systems to pass data among schools. Therefore, getting good data from other schools and tracking students across county lines, let alone across state lines, is going to be very difficult. The second problem I see is that the guideline that online schools must be provided student performance data and prior student records on academic histories from the school the student previously attended in a timely manner. Even in the guideline itself, it mentions a perverse incentive that the student's prior district may feel it is losing the student to the online school and may be very slow in passing along student performance data. They suggest the state should play a role either in requiring that the data be forthcoming or creating a repository themselves. This may work in some states, but in 50 states, with all of the different counties and all the different data systems out there, along with a perverse incentive, I really think it's going to be difficult to get good data on each student in a timely manner anytime in the next few years. Given these challenges, the one positive thing I see is that online schools such as the Florida Virtual School already are implementing many of these iNACOL standards. For instance, many of their courses have a pre-test and an end of course test. They also track students individually, and therefore, because they are so large and have so many students going to it, we may be able to get data on what works at that school without all of the other things happening. So we may be able to at least go in the right direction as we're going in the long term in the right direction.